So this week we'll be talking about memory. So last week we already talked a little bit about some memory systems, and we were talking specifically about semantic memory and how that's structured in language with regards to our concepts and so on. So we'll cover semantic memory again, but thinking about how this relates to our memory of individual events or episodes, our kind of declarative or episodic memory. So before doing that, what I'd like you to do is just introduce you to somebody who has amnesia. So this is obviously a fictional character from the film Memento, of somebody who in effect lost his ability to acquire new memories as a result of a trauma in which his wife was shot and so on. So he was able to remember things before his accident but not after. Most people with amnesia actually have problems with both, remembering things before their accident as well as after it. So I'll show you a little case study of somebody not from fiction who does have amnesia. Any kind of comments or thoughts on this? Is there anything that seemed a little bit odd? I mean, there's obviously lots of things odd, but anything that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So yeah, so it's a question of kind of how much he kind of does know or doesn't know. So obviously he wasn't that concerned about finding out that his sister was getting married or so. He seems quite accepting of some things as well. He also was, you know, again, some kind of partial awareness of doctors and so on, of kind of, you know, the fact that there might be something wrong, that he's not kind of having thoughts and so on. So, you know, there's almost kind of some, you know, insight and so on. One of the things that you kind of find is about, you know, that he was playing the piano expertly, and that this is kind of one of the classic things that you might expect, that you don't forget how to do that, but you might forget, you know, other things as well. So certainly the way that it's often portrayed in the movies is that this is kind of a problem, it's often portrayed in the movies as being a problem of short-term memory, so you're only holding on to things for a few seconds. It's exactly the opposite. It's a problem in long-term memory. You can hold on to things for a few seconds, but you can't retain them into the longer term. So it's a problem in long-term memory. I can't emphasise that enough. But it is as if you're living in the present, that you haven't got an obvious past that you can recall, or not in a straightforward way, or even imagining the future. That's one of the things we'll talk about. So the most famous case study who's been studied in depth is actually HM, so not Clive, who was in the video, simply because he was he underwent surgery at a young age when he was actually older than 10. I think he was about 16 or 18, but because he was having epilepsy, and they removed part of the medial temporal lobes, particularly the hippocampus. And following this, he had a profound amnesia. So HM, this operation was done in the early 1950s. The original paper was published in 1952. And before that, people actually weren't sure what the hippocampus was. But they knew where it was. It's part of the limbic system. And people actually thought it was more to do with emotions and so on, because if you had temporal lobe epilepsy, you would have unusual auras and kind of other kinds of experience. So they thought it was more to do with emotions than it was to do with memory. So this really took people by surprise to see this dense amnesia. And of course, it's been shown many times since. So people such as Clive Waring. So HM, for instance, can't remember his last meal, where he lives, or his own present age. So when he's asked to remember his age, this probably was in his 60s or 70s, he could be off by over 40 years, for instance. Again, not recognising his own face in the mirror, but also not being shocked when seeing his own face in the mirror, which suggests some kind of acceptance of it. So if I was to look into the mirror and see myself as a 5-year-old, I would be pretty shocked. Whereas, you know, people with amnesia aren't necessarily when they're kind of going back to a former self. But does HM lack memory? Does Clive Waring lack memory? Well, obviously he knows the words in his language, and this is a form of memory. It's not something you're born knowing, it's something you have to learn and acquire. You can play the piano and so on. So what is it that is actually lost here? And the really kind of puzzling thing about this is that the whole brain is capable of learning and memory. And this is through the property of the brain known as plasticity. So the brain's ability to change as a result of experience. So plasticity is about kind of forming kind of new connections in the brain. You have protein synthesis at synapses and so on, when two neurons fire together. It's kind of understood at very basic mechanisms, but that is not something that happens just in the hippocampus. It's something that happens throughout the brain. So this kind of then poses the question, well, what is special about the hippocampus? What is the hippocampus doing if plasticity is a brain-level property? And nor is it the case that plasticity is something that just happens to you at one point in life. Clearly, as you're learning now, you're learning new information, being in this lecture, being in university, and this is due to plasticity. It's not something that just happens in childhood. It might be maximal at certain points in development, but it's not something that you ever lose. Of course, elderly people are capable of learning new things. Their brains are plastic too, albeit to a lesser extent. So the question, so really what we have to think about is memory and learning being a property of the whole brain, but really the idea that some brain systems are specialised for different kinds of information. So some regions are specialised for memorising the objects that you see, the words that you know, procedures that you know, such as playing a piano, riding a bike, or maybe for remembering episodes or kind of contextualising your life and so on. So different regions are involved in different aspects of memory. How do we kind of characterise what these different memory systems are? Well, this is the most popular kind of textbook example of this that's used. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily universally agreed on, but it at least provides a shorthand way of thinking about it. So one of the first divisions that you've got here is between long-term memory and short-term memory. So short-term memory is really just holding on to things in mind. So normally for a few seconds, so holding a sentence, and as soon as you're not concentrating on that sentence, it's then no longer in short-term memory. And there's nothing in between. According to this division, it goes into long-term memory or it goes nowhere. You forget it, you never process it, it's been and gone. So we'll talk a little bit about short-term working memory. Then you've got another distinction here in long-term memory between memory that is seen as being explicit or declarative. So these are memories that you can kind of talk about and share with people. So this would include memories for events. This morning I got up, I ate porridge, I then went to work, I did this. That would be a kind of episodic memory. Semantic memory would be things like what is the capital of France, your knowledge of what this object is and so on would kind of be semantic memory, the fact that you use this for writing and so on. And then you've got non-declarative memory, which is seen as being kind of more implicit, or you certainly don't have as much insight into it. So here you would have things like procedural memory. This would be things such as how you actually use implements, that you hold a pen like this rather than like that. That would be kind of procedural knowledge, how to ride a bike, play a piano, this sort of thing. This would be kind of your knowledge of the perceptual world, so what objects look like. So to some extent, patients with visual agnosia, we could think of them as having a memory problem. What they've lost maybe is their kind of store of what the objects look like, that they can see lines and edges, but they can't map that on to kind of volumetric descriptions of objects that they used to be able to see. For instance, some aspects of agnosia we could think of like this. But to some extent we could say that that's a memory problem. It's not what we would normally think of as being memory, but in this scheme it would be. Here this would be kind of Pavlovian type conditioning, so you see a light and you feel electric shock. The next time round you see a light and you show a skin conductance response. You have a sweating, it's like, ooh, I'm expecting something bad, for instance. So patients with amnesia, they would show this kind of response, that they would see a light, for instance, and then they would go, they'd start sweating. It's like, I'm expecting something bad. If you ask them, what do you expect when you see a light? It's like, I don't know, I don't expect anything. That's what you say. So they can learn some things and not others, but they can't quite verbalise the contingency of what's going on. And this would be similar kinds of conditioning based approaches, seeing something over and over again, you would pay less attention to it, for instance. That's a kind of memory-based effect. So one of the issues with this is that it kind of assumes that there are very kind of clear, clean divisions between completely separable systems. And to some extent, there is some separability, but also things can interact and things aren't completely separate, maybe you've got to go via one system in order to learn another, or maybe there are some things that are kind of shared across multiple systems. And this is where it becomes a little bit more complex and a little bit kind of at the kind of frontiers of our current knowledge, is thinking about alternative ways outside of this classical way of dividing up all the systems of the brain. So short-term memory, as I've mentioned, is just holding things in mind. And one of the key characteristics of this is the idea of limited capacity. You can only hold so much information in mind at once. How much information? Well, we'll talk about it a bit. So some people say it's 4, some people say it's 7, varying or whatever. But typically it's thought of as being in single figures, but we'll come back to that. Long-term memory is information that's stored and need not be even consciously accessible, and the idea is it doesn't really have an obvious capacity limit. Obviously there is a capacity limit in terms of the number of neurons, the number of connections and so on, but it's not something that you could easily quantify. If you think about, you know, how many episodes can you remember in your life and so on, how many faces. I mean, there may be ways of doing it, but it's seen as being, you can update it and so on. You can learn about new faces as you go along and so on. So all information effectively is in long-term memory unless you're presently bringing it to mind. So if I think about an event and then start to rehearse it in my mind, I'm retrieving something from long-term memory, hold it in mind in short-term memory, and then as soon as I move my train of thoughts on, it's gone. It's gone back into long-term memory. That's the idea. You kind of bring things to mind and then let them go. So one of the ideas behind short-term memory is that they're divided into different stores depending on the kind of information you're processing. And the most kind of common model here is Baddeley's idea of kind of a more verbal, or what he calls a phonological short-term store, and a more visual or visuospatial store, although there might be others. He talks about one about holding events in short-term memory as well. So this is kind of classically assessed using what are called span tasks. So I would read aloud, say, a list of words like door, skeleton, cat, theatre, chair, and then ask you to repeat them back, okay? What's typically, or you do it with digits. What you typically find is that most people can recall about 7 of these kind of verbal items. And Miller suggests it's kind of plus or minus 2, so a kind of a normal range of between 5 and 9. So this again is kind of one of these classic experiments in psychology. He also argues that these are meaningful chunks. So what he means by that is that that provided you can chunk things meaningfully, then you might be able to hold 7 of them. So you might have a digit span of, say, 7 digits. But if I give you years like 1945, 1812, 20, the year 2000 or whatever, the idea is that your span then is not the sum of the digits. It's something that is a chunk, where the chunk is a meaningful unit. In this case, kind of famous or landmark years in history. So this was Miller's claim. Others have argued actually that the capacity is lower. So Cohen argues that the span is actually 4 plus or minus 0. And his basis for thinking this is actually that if you're not refreshing things, if you kind of are holding other things in mind and you can't kind of use your long-term memory and so on, the amount you can actually hold in short-term memory is a lot lower. Other kinds of information suggest that it's not just meaningful chunks as well. So here, this is data from Baddeley, in which you've got short words such as you know, cat, dog, whatever, and then long words such as skeleton, binoculars. And this is just the number of words correct. And what you can see here, just comparing this point versus this point, is that as soon as you've got polysyllabic words, words with lots more syllables, your ability to hold on to things goes down, and it's not 7, it's actually lower than that. So this suggests that actually it's not just meaningful items that you're holding, that there is an element of holding in mind the actual sounds themselves, and the more sounds you've got to hold, the more. So it suggests that what you're holding in mind just isn't just meaning, it's meaning and sounds and so on. Actually, these are all interacting together. Here, this is when you can't rehearse it. So here what you're doing is that that when you're listening to somebody reading them aloud, you're going 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're counting in your head whilst you're listening to somebody saying them. And this stops you rehearsing the sequence as you're listening to it. And as you do that, the capacity goes down as well. So this is the kind of evidence that, that basically there's, when you take out a mechanism for rehearsing things, your actual capacity has a much lower limit than what was originally thought. What is kind of interesting is that you get a similar number in the visual domain as you get in the spoken system, which is kind of puzzling. So you might imagine that you would have different rules here. But this is kind of visual short-term memory, in which you're shown, for instance, a series of things like that, and then afterwards you're shown, say, an object here, and you've got to say what was there, whether it was a red line or it's like this or like that. Or you're shown something where one of the lines differs and you've got to say whether it's the same or different. There are various kinds of paradigms. What you find here in this kind of paradigm is that, again, up to about 4 objects, people are quite accurate, and then beyond that they become progressively error-prone. Okay? With this. So this is 2, 4, 6. What you also find is that it is 4 objects and it's not the number of features. So here what you might have is that you might have 4 different orientations, 4 different colours, and potentially 4 different shapes. So in a way you've got multiple different things to hold in mind. You're not just holding in 4, you've effectively got 4 times 4 times 4 or whatever it is. And what you find is that your capacity doesn't go down. So it's the number of objects rather than the actual number of features. So 4 colours and 4 shapes is just as difficult as 4 colours by themselves. You don't get a reduction with that. So it suggests that it is to do with actually treating them as different kind of objects in space that matters. So another idea that's kind of come about with regards to short-term memory is just thinking about short-term memory as being a temporary activation of your long-term memory stores. And the kind of evidence that people have for this kind of comes from brain imaging. So this here is an fMRI study in which people associate, for instance, faces with a house, or they associate a face and then the face disappears and you've got to remember the face over time. So what you've got there here is brain activity in 2 different, this is time across here. Here you've got activity to a part of the brain that responds to scenes in pink, and a part of the brain that responds to faces in blue. So what happens is that as you show people a face, that they activate the face-related area, then the face disappears, and then what people do is that they have to imagine what goes with that face. So they've already been trained that this particular house goes with that face. And what you can find is that in the same part of the brain that's involved in perceiving faces, it gets switched on by seeing a face when the face disappears. So you can switch on the face, the house-related part of the brain after seeing a face. So it's almost as if you're using your perceptual representations to think about how things go together. That you just associated a face with a house. You see a face, you don't see the house, but you nevertheless activate that part of the brain. And here this is just seeing a face, the face disappears, and you have to hold on to a memory of the face you've just seen and hold on to the memory of a house. So this so other people argue that basically all short-term memory is that you're just activating long-term memory representations, or so your perceptual knowledge of faces, houses, words, whatever it might be from the top down, and that this is all short-term memory is. If that's the case, then this kind of poses the problem as to why there's a capacity limit. So if you've got thousands of faces that you can memorize and store in your head, why is there an apparent limit of 4 houses, 4 faces, 4 words, and so on? So we know tens of thousands of words. What stops us holding short-term memory them in mind? Well, if you've got separate stores, what holds them in mind is that the stores themselves are kind of have a limited capacity. But if you're just activating long-term memory, what stops you getting more than 4 at the same time? So people puzzle about this, but the idea here is that you've kind of got interference that you can only activate so many at the same time without them kind of cancelling each other out. So what isn't clear at the moment is whether or not short-term memory is just the temporary activation of long-term memory, or whether there really is a separate store. If it is just the temporary activation, then why can you only get 4 or maybe 7 items active at the same time, given that long-term memory is this? But there does seem to be the case that short-term memory kind of activates your long-term store, whether or not there's anything in between. So it suggests basically that although we kind of have this distinction here, that it might not be quite as clear-cut as people used to believe here. With that. Okay. So if we have a look at our other, so if we now look at other systems, so if we have a look at the ones in green rather than contrasting the two in purple here, these would be kind of some of our more implicit ones. So here this is kind of knowledge of the structure of objects. So if you have a look at these 4 objects and decide which ones are possible and which ones are impossible, for instance, you kind of know that that's a possible object, even though it's not one you name or would know what to do with. That's a possible one, and these ones here are impossible. But in a way, what you've got in your visual system is you kind of have a way of storing how edges and surfaces can be combined, and there's something that tells you that these ones here are not possible. And the idea is that even when you're shown unfamiliar objects such as these, that they can kind of activate the visual system and tell you something about them. And this is kind of a form of memory, that you've got a memory for how objects are constructed. What you also find is that if you see this object and then you see it again from another rotation, you're much faster at saying that that can be a real object. Whereas you don't show it with this. So if you see this from a different angle, you don't show a faster reaction time the second time you see it. So it's almost if you can't kind of access that store, that you're treating these objects more as pictures, whereas these ones here you're treating more as volumetric things that kind of match the structure of how your visual system works, and you can respond to them more faster a second time around. So priming is one of the ways in which you kind of study some of these implicit systems. So perceptual priming is here. And here, this would be an example of perceptual priming the object domain. Here, the way it's done verbally is that you show people a bunch of words. So you show them the word house. And then at another time, you ask them, can you think of any word that begins with HO? Okay? And what you find is that people are much more likely to say house here if they've seen it than if they haven't. But here the task isn't to remember. All it is say the first thing that comes to mind, and that's seen as being priming. Okay? Or even just reading the word house will be faster if it's something they've seen before. And the idea is that you've got your long-term representations of words, and if you activate them a second time around, you kind of boost them by seeing them. And you can show this also with fMRI. So if you see a word and then you see it again, the bold activity the second time you see it is kind of lower. It's almost as if you don't need to activate it as much to access it. So you can see it both in terms of reaction times and in brain activity. So what are the causes and symptoms of amnesia? So which of these symptoms are impaired in amnesia, and does this kind of support the idea for these very clean divisions of memory systems? So what you find is damage in amnesia. The hippocampus is the structure that's kind of classically impaired in amnesia, but there's a whole set of other, so the hippocampus is in the medial temporal lobes here. There's a whole host of other grey matter tissues around the hippocampus that are also important that tend to be damaged. So the entorhinal cortex is one of the main kind of inputs into the hippocampus, and then you've got other cortex around it as well. So often when somebody has brain damage, such as in HM, it doesn't just affect the hippocampus, it affects other tissues. So you can't be sure exactly which tissues are giving rise to it. And one of the kind of changes in the last 10 to 15 years is that we can kind of start to delineate what these different structures do, rather than just talk about the medial temporal lobes together and this all being the same kind of symptoms in amnesia. There are some differences depending on the anatomy, and this has come about partly through functional imaging of the normal brain, but also being able to look more precisely at where the lesions are of people who have amnesia and other deficits. So amnesia can come around from various regions. So as a result of brain surgery, so that was HM. As a result of strokes, you might get brain damage in this region, head injury, certain kind of viruses that affect the brain, or there's this syndrome called Korsakoff syndrome related to long-term alcoholism, where people can develop symptoms of amnesia. And what you find is that, so if you were to have your brain injury, say, when you're age 20, and if you imagine that you're age 30 now, is that at the time of becoming amnesic, you will have problems in acquiring new memories between your age of 20 to your age of 30. So it's almost as if you become stranded in time from being like a 20-year-old, that you struggle to acquire new memories. And this is called the anterograde period, so the period in between having your amnesia and where you are now in terms of age. Okay? But what you also find is that you lose some of the memories before. So here I've done this as kind of a shaded one. And what you find is that if you become amnesic at the age of 20, you might forget about what you did when you were age 19. You might have a few memories for when you were 18, a few more for when you're 17, but you might remember quite well your childhood, for instance. So most amnesics remember their childhood, and in fact their early adolescence. It's quite unusual to become amnesic at 20, obviously, because you tend not to have these kinds of injuries. And obviously this is kind of what you also see in Alzheimer's, which also affects this brain region, although other regions as well, is that people with Alzheimer's struggle to acquire new information. So this is the more kind of anterograde. They forget things from their past, but they tend to forget things from their recent past and hold on to things from maybe 10 years ago, or when they were, at school and so on. They can remember those sorts of things here. So again, it can vary to what extent the kind of retrograde period goes back, whether they just forget 1 or 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years. That can be quite variable. So what memory systems are impaired in amnesia? Well, I'll go through evidence, but the evidence seems to suggest that it's one system that's particularly impaired, that's episodic memory. And the others are some extent spared and some extent also impaired. So it doesn't have a completely clean cut. It depends partly on what the brain lesion is, but where the brain lesion is, but also partly on what kind of tests you give to them as well. So it's a mixture of both kind of context and kind of content as well. So what about short-term memory? If you give people with amnesia digit span, their digit span is 7 plus or minus 2, in the same way as yours is. Okay? So they seem to have a kind of a normal short-term memory. And obviously, as soon as they've kind of given up on that, then they've forgotten what the digit is. So for instance, HM tried to hold on to a number. So the classic thing would be memorizing a telephone number here. So HM tried memorizing this telephone number for 15 minutes, which he could do, and he did it by continuously repeating it. But as soon as he'd stopped and moved on to something different, it was gone. So within a minute of stopping, not only could he not remember the telephone number, he had no memory of ever being asked to recall a telephone number. He says, I don't even remember being asked that question, let alone what it was. Okay? So it's not a question of it lasting 5 seconds or 10 seconds or a minute. It's just a question of how long you keep holding it in mind. So again, this is a bit of the goldfish analogy here, that you can hold on to something by rehearsing it, repeating it, potentially for hours, but who would do that, What about non-declarative memory? So this is our kind of priming study here, where you show a word such as defend, and then you ask the participant here just to think of the first word that comes to mind. If they're asked the first word to come to mind, they're more likely to recall defend, having been shown it, than they are a related word, such as definite, for instance. But if they're asked, have you seen the word defend before, they would be inclined to say no, or that they would be inclined to guess. So although they're more likely to reproduce that word, having seen it before, if they're asked, do you remember seeing that word, they would deny it, or have very low confidence with the memory. So that suggests that the activation of this word kind of within the language-based system is kind of primed, it's kind of being boosted in its activity. But the memory associated with that word, the event base, the event around that word itself is not being well formed. That you can't kind of put it into context, in effect. They can also learn new skills as well as remember old ones. So remember an old skill is obviously the riding the bike example. Here this is kind of mirror-based writing, where basically what you have to do is that you can't see your own hand, you see your own hand in a mirror, and you have to kind of draw around, say, a shape like a star. So obviously, if you're looking in a mirror, you would have to move your hand what looks like to the left in order to make it move to the right in real space. So it looks as if you're moving your hand this way, whereas in fact in the mirror it's going that way. So you have to it's a tricky thing to do, basically. So what HM did is that he learned this task on 3 days. I don't know whether they were consecutive days or not, it doesn't really matter. But what you can see here is that an error is the number of times you kind of wiggle outside of the lines here between the two narrow lines. So the first attempt on the first day, he made nearly 30 errors kind of wiggling around. And then this goes down to, I don't know what that number is, about 8 errors on the second attempt. So he is learning here. He's learnt this because you can show his skill has increased. But then on the second day, you can see that he's not gone back up to 30. He's retained that knowledge over time, and he's kind of improved further. And on the third day, he's retained that knowledge as well. But again, if you were to ask H.N., do you remember doing this task before? Have you ever done this before? He would say, no, I've never done this task before. So again, here, there's objective evidence that he has learnt something, so otherwise his performance would rebound here. And that he's retained that knowledge over days, so in what we would think of as being a long-term memory kind of period without the rehearsing in between. Okay. So this would again suggest that amnesics have good kind of priming, and they have good procedural memory. And we know that the kind of our knowledge of words, our knowledge of objects and so on, again, is more cortical structured. So the temporal lobes for spoken words, you know, the visual ventral stream for objects and written words, and that these seem to be supporting this kind of memory here. And this is another kind of rule-based game in which what you have to do is that you're shown these kinds of cards, and you kind of pair them with, and then you turn them over and you see whether it's sunny or whether it's rainy, okay? And what you effectively have to do is that over time you see this and you have to decide whether it's sunny or rainy. But the rules are kind of quite complex, so people struggle to kind of articulate what the rules are. So it's seen as being a kind of more implicit learning, is that it's not the case that whenever they see squares it's going to be rainy. It might just increase the chances of this, or sometimes it's a square with fewer numbers and it's 1. So these are very hard to learn rules. And what you find is that amnesics are capable of learning this kind of weather prediction game here. Whereas patients with Parkinson's disease aren't. So this is kind of procedural memory. So Parkinson's disease involves the basal ganglia, so a circuit involved in kind of motor actions, and it's seen as being involved in motor skills. So again, amnesics don't have damage in the same region as patients with Parkinson's. So amnesics are able to learn this kind of skill, whereas patients with Parkinson's disease aren't. Here, this is a different kind of memory. So here, this is just trying to predict, is it going to be sunny or rainy or whatever, okay? So this kind of more rule-based learning. Here, this is more kind of traditional memory, in which they're asked, have you ever seen this particular pattern of dots before? And obviously they would show some patterns of dots which they genuinely hadn't seen before. And what you find is that the controls can remember seeing the patterns of dots. The amnesics can't, but the patients with Parkinson's can. So again, what this suggests is that you've got different kind of memory systems here. That those patients with Parkinson's disease, they can remember seeing these ones, but they're struggling to associate the actual rules of them. They're failing to learn the kind of consequences of these cards. Whereas the amnesics are learning the kind of the consequences, but then struggling to remember what it is that they've seen. Okay. So this again provides some clues as to what kind of brain systems are supporting these different kinds of memory. So this would be kind of a procedural memory, although it's not a classic kind of motor skill. It's a more kind of abstract procedural memory, or more symbolic procedures. Okay, that's how it's been described. So what about semantic memory? So semantic memory is like kind of knowledge of words and language. So when you look at a patient such as Clive Waring, you would not just think that there is anything wrong with his language or his kind of conceptual knowledge. The problem with this here relates to what I've previously described as being kind of a temporal gradient or Rebo's law. And that's the fact that people with amnesia can tend to remember things from a long time ago, from childhood and adolescence, but not more recent things. Now, it might be the case that the reason why they seem to have good semantic knowledge is that you acquire all your kind of conceptual understanding as a child, whereas your knowledge of events is something that is a lifetime kind of endeavour, that you're constantly updating your kind of knowledge of events and places and so on. It's not something that just happens or that you acquire mainly in childhood. So, although there seems to be this obvious dissociation between episodic and semantic memory, it may just be the case that actually it's not a fair test, because the semantic memory is acquired from childhood. Okay. So what you can do is that you can do tests, for instance, looking at new kinds of semantic knowledge. So, for instance, recognizing faces of, say, Osama bin Laden, although he's not so current now, you know, faces who've been around in the last few years, Jeremy Corbyn or whatever, and seeing whether patients with amnesia can remember those. And the evidence is generally that they struggle with recent semantic memory or recent kind of knowledge. So it suggests that actually that although it seems to be the case that episodic is more impaired than semantic memory, when you've got fairer tests, it may not be the case. So HM, for instance, was unable to learn new vocabulary after his amnesia. So you know he was still using kind of 1950s kind of gee whiz kind of American language, rather than updating it to more contemporary phrases that you would have since then. So this is certainly what was thought up until the last 5 or 10 years ago, but subsequently it's been found that some amnesics are able to update their vocabulary and their real-world knowledge, and others aren't. And one of the reasons for this is the extent to which other regions in the medial temporal lobe are impaired. So this region here, called the entorhinal cortex, seems to be more important for learning semantic memory. So both the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex are damaged in HN. So he lost his episodic memory, but was unable to kind of update his vocabulary and his new kind of semantic knowledge. Whereas for other patients, they have more selective damage here, and they seem able to at least partially update that. So it seems to relate to the anatomy here as to whether or not semantic memory goes. So what I want to talk about now is actually what is it that the medial temporal lobes are doing? What is the mechanism? So if the whole brain is capable of learning and plasticity, what are the special properties of these parts of the brain that give rise to amnesia and other kinds of memory-related conditions? So there are three different theories. The first one, as the name suggests, standard consolidation theory, is the one that's been the standard explanation of amnesia and the function of the medial temporal lobes for many, many years. And the last two are kind of newer kids on the block. But basically, the idea is that that amnesia is a problem in consolidation. So by consolidation, what we mean is kind of translating something temporary into longer-term memories. Okay, but obviously this is something that can happen in the brain. So the suggested idea by Squire et al. Is that it's the long-term consolidation, particularly of events that are specific in time and place, so or contextually based memories. So it's about linking different kinds of information together. So it's not just about words or objects and so on. It's about linking words and objects into spatial locations, into temporal context and who's been there. So it's about having multiple different kinds of information, and that this is a part of the brain that is involved in drawing them together using that. So this is the standard consolidation theory, particularly that it's declarative memory, so both semantic and episodic. This is what people such as Squire have suggested is important for the medial temporal lobes and is down in amnesia itself. So it's about linking different kinds of information together and consolidating them, so making them permanent over time. So one way of thinking about this here is that this is kind of time going across there, and that here these are kind of cortical modules. So you can imagine that this is your kind of memory for words, your memory for faces, say your memory for emotions and so on. And that in effect, when you've got an event happening, you would have the words there, you would have the emotion, the feeling of that event, and you would have the kind of visual descriptions. And the hippocampus effectively kind of stores a set of links or pointers to all these distributed modules, which are kind of residing in different parts of the brain. So the idea is that memories are kind of stored everywhere through the brain, but the hippocampus acts as kind of a marker or pointer system, a kind of an index to it. And then what happens over time, so again, the people have talked about roles of sleeping and so on, is that these different kind of units in the module start to connect to each other. Okay, so you can see them kind of building connections here and depend less on the hippocampus. And then over time, the idea is that they become independent of the hippocampus, and that your memory traces have effectively transferred themselves from this kind of linked hippocampus kind of cortex or whatever to residing fully in the cortex. So the idea is that by consolidation, what you're doing is that you're kind of burning the memory in and the associations with kind of more cortical to cortical connections or cortical to subcortical or whatever, but they're somehow becoming hippocampally independent, so that the memory trace is effectively then bound together as a distributed kind of representation. So this is all well and good. So what this would explain then is if the hippocampus is down, then your ability to form new kinds of memories goes. So this explains the anterograde deficits, the inability to form new kinds of episodes, but actually within each of these modules you may be able to acquire new words or new kind of priming and new kind of skills, because these modules can still function independently. They just can't become linked together using this kind of hippocampal network, in effect, that does that. So one of the big issues with this is that this consolidation is all about making stable new events. So why is it the case that damaging the hippocampus would lead to loss of old memories? why if you become amnesic at the age of 30 would you lose the last, say, 5 years of your life if all the hippocampus is doing is burning in new memories? The way that they get around this in this theory is by saying that it takes years and years for the hippocampus to complete this transition. So in effect, if you were to become amnesic at the age of, say, 30, then what would happen is that you would lose memories that are in this kind of intermediate transition stage of transferring things from the hippocampus to the cortex. So not only would you have a problem in consolidating new memories, but memories that are only partially consolidated would go. And that this is what drives what's called a temporal gradient, or Rebo's law. So this is kind of another famous case of amnesia of somebody who wrote their autobiography in the 1980s. So it's very unusual to be able to kind of tap somebody's memory for their own life unless it's written down somewhere, or you've got a wife or a husband who knows all the stories from their life. So this is it was a professor who'd written their autobiography in the 1980s and were then asked experimentally to recall certain events from their time period. So in this case, they've become amnesic for a good kind of decade and a half of information here where they're unable to recall that, and then presumably they're born at some point kind of around the First World War here, so they can remember lots of childhood memories, and then it kind of drops off here. So this is kind of a kind of gradient. The idea is that the memories from the last decade or so were still dependent on the hippocampus. The ones earlier and so on are less and less dependent on the hippocampus and being transferred into other parts of the brain. So this is one kind of explanation for it. There are other kind of competing explanations, and we'll talk about them when we come to other theories. So other people say, this is ridiculous. Why would you have a kind of a consolidation mechanism that takes decades to work? Surely the brain would have kind of outlined memory traces that happen a lot faster. And certainly in animal models of consolidation, so obviously these are kind of mice or rat models, there's no evidence that it takes decades or years to do this. It doesn't, it seems to happen on timescales of weeks or so on. So people say, no, it's not clear that this would happen like this. So what are the alternative kind of explanations? Well, one explanation is basically that the stimuli from older decades are easier, so things that happen to you as a childhood, maybe your first girlfriend or something, are just things that you're not going to forget. They are by themselves more memorable, but by the time you get to your 10s, you kind of, or whatever, they're more forgetful or whatever. They don't have the same significance. There might be something in that, but actually there are enough studies now that have tried to match these very carefully and show that you still can get these gradients. Of course, it might be that some memories weren't properly consolidated. So, for instance, in the case of alcoholism, it might be the case that, if you become an alcoholic here, that actually you don't remember things because you're drunk all the time. But again, there are enough case studies of people who don't have this to discount that. The third one is an explanation that was suggested many years ago, but has come back in vogue now. And this is the idea that our old memories are kind of more semantic-like, so they're more like stories than they are like reliving an episode. So when I recall, for instance, going on a particular holiday as a child, it's almost like telling a story rather than actually remembering something that happened to you. So the idea here is that actually you're using a different kind of memory system, and that in effect, maybe all your episodic memories have gone. It's just that older memories have just been retold so many times that they're more like a story than they are like a memory. Okay? And this is also the problem with kind of John learning these facts, is that are these memories or are they just stories? And are you going to store a story differently from this kind of complex kind of contextual memory that is suggested here? Another theory is that basically the more you remember something, every time you recall an event, it's like laying down a new kind of memory. So just me recalling an event as a child, I'm effectively creating a new memory, a memory of thinking about that event in this context and in this room and telling you guys about it, okay? And that in itself is creating a new memory. So older memories, because you retell them more, you effectively develop more memory traces for each retelling, and that this makes them more invulnerable. And of course, there is the notion that basically things are reconsolidated. So what are the kind of rival accounts for this that would look at that? Well, I'll show you a couple. But this is kind of evidence that supports Squire's view of standard consolidation, that it has a time-limited role. And this is that basically patients with semantic dementia have the opposite memory profile. So this here is patients with Alzheimer's disease who tend to have the more kind of amnesic pattern, that they can't remember things that have happened in the last few years, but they can remember to a better extent events from their childhood and their early adulthood. So these are patients who've lost damage to the medial temporal lobes. Semantic dementia is more damage to the actual outer cortex itself, your temporal lobes and so on, where the memories are stored. So what you find is that basically the patients with semantic dementia are good at recalling things that happened to them recently. And the idea is that they can do that because they've got an intact hippocampus, that things haven't yet spread into the cortex, which is being degraded in effect. So controls are kind of good across the period. So this is kind of supporting the idea that there might be separate systems here that you actually transfer from one into another. But there are other accounts, as I've mentioned. So the multiple trace theory is kind of being put forward by Moscovich and others. And basically what their claim is that the more you kind of recall an event, the more semantic-like it becomes. So rather than having a sharp distinction between episodic and semantic memories, what they talk about is the hippocampus storing episodic-like information and the rest of the medial temporal lobe storing kind of schematic memories. So a schematic memory might be something that is not very specific, so something that is more kind of story-like rather than very contextualized. So they talk about, for instance, that learning about a new city might be highly contextualized and dependent on the hippocampus. So again, here in the case of John learning these facts, because you're doing it in a kind of a particular context, that you're effectively treating this kind of new semantic memories like an episode. Whereas old episodic memories might be more like well-told stories and not depend on the hippocampus. So this is kind of a different theory, and specifically what they argue is that the hippocampus is always needed for recalling something as an episode, but over time the amount of episodes you've got just disappear and become more kind of schematic-like. So their kind of claim here is that these are more kind of schematic memories and not really like reliving a memory in its original context. That would be their claim. It's not that these have been transferred out, it's just that they've changed. So there's somewhat subtle differences, but again, they talk about consolidation, but it's a different kind of mechanism. So in the standard model that's kind of existed for decades, what you're doing is that you're taking memories that are bound in the hippocampus and you're transferring them into the cortex or other parts of them. Here what's happening is that they're always remaining in the hippocampus, but they're kind of being transformed into more story-like structures or more kind of schematic or more semantic-like structures over time. Okay? So it's not just a question of transferring, it's more a question of transforming. So the hippocampus always stores that kind of memory and only that kind of memory. That's their claim. How can you distinguish between these theories? Well, some evidence in favour of the idea of this is that hippocampus is activated by remote as well as recent memories in fMRI. When you're asked to think about and kind of contextualise. So remembering itself seems to involve that. There's a whole kind of literature about imagining specific episodes. So if I'm asked to imagine my 60th birthday, for instance, and who's going to be there and what I'm going to do, this will activate my hippocampus. And again, it's a bit of a puzzle why that is, because it's not retrieving a memory. Maybe you're kind of using previous memories to imagine it or whatever. But for whatever reason, imagining future episodes seems to depend on the hippocampus. And again, people with amnesia struggle to imagine the future is one of the particular future events. And this is a bit of a challenge for the standard consolidation theory. Why should the hippocampus be involved in imagination? It's not a challenge for this because basically what they're saying is that the hippocampus is about storing particular kinds of context, and it's involved in creating episodes, irrespective of whether the episodes are in the past, the ancient past, the recent past, or even in the future. And there is other evidence here that basically there's evidence that if you kind of have rats, for instance, that have some conditioned fear associations, there's evidence that it depends less and less on the hippocampus over time, which is what you would expect from both theories. But what they show actually is that moving it out of the hippocampus is involved about making it less sensitive to context. Okay? So this is the idea that you're not just transferring memories out of the hippocampus, you're actually transforming them. You're making your memories less context specific and more kind of schematic. Okay. So this is kind of, to some extent, is a recent challenge to this idea. This is obviously old data on the hippocampus that is also being brought to bear to kind of challenge this view. And this kind of relates to the idea that within the hippocampus you store spatial maps. So we've already talked about this in regards, London taxi drivers kind of increasing the amount of grey matter, and also place cells that you find, single cell recordings in animals, that when they're in a particular location, these neurons fire when they're there. So this evidence has been known a long time that the hippocampus is involved in this. But one theory is that basically that the hippocampus, what it's doing is that it's just storing the kind of spatial context of events. So it's very similar to the multiple trace theory in the sense that it's seen as being always important for particular types of memory, but maybe over time you kind of forget exactly the spatial context and they're becoming less contextualized in effect. So both of these, both the second and the third theories assume that you always need your hippocampus for episodic or kind of very contextualized memories, but they also have the claim that over time memories just become less contextualized. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about it. And the evidence for this is, I won't go through the specifics of this task, but it's unusual in that it's a short-term memory task. So you see a view like this, and then you have to remember which of the views you've seen. So it's from a different angle. You're given like 30 seconds to look at it. Controls aren't at 100% on this either. But again, patients with amnesia are very bad at kind of manipulating scenes and kind of navigation with them, even though this is a short-term memory task. So the claim is that actually the hippocampus is involved in storing spatial context. Okay, so the reason why they can do digit span is the idea is that digits are kind of just there in your verbal kind of memory store. And the hippocampus is very much to do with storing space and spatial context. But that's what remembering is all about, is remembering when and where things are encountered. So what about navigation? So again, one of the things that amnesics are very bad at is kind of navigating around. And this seems to be the case for old roots, even roots from their childhood, that amnesics tend to forget about this. Or what they remember are very schematic routes. So they might remember the main A roads, but not the B roads. So again, this is Eleanor Maguire, who looked at the taxi driver study where you get more grey matter if you learn to drive a taxi. She managed to find an amnesic taxi driver, so somebody who'd had a stroke. What you find is that they lose their ability to kind of navigate, on previously familiar routes. Although what they retain is just a very broad schematic layout. And this again suggests the idea that the hippocampus might be storing very specific kind of spatial or contextualized memories, but actually some aspects of that you might store elsewhere in kind of a more schematic type of layout. Right, so the last little part won't take that long. Are there any more kind of questions on these theories? I appreciate that the distinctions are quite subtle. But really the key difference is whether or not the memories are being transferred out of the hippocampus or whether they're being transformed from one kind of information into another. And that's the kind of crux of the theories. So before fMRI and brain imaging, everybody was interested in the medial temporal lobes and what they contribute to memory. Since brain imaging, it's kind of, people have reflected a lot more on other parts of the brain and why they're involved. So pretty much any fMRI study of memory, you often get the frontal lobes active, but you often struggle to get the hippocampus active, often because the hippocampus is active in your kind of control conditions or whatever, so they subtract out. It's very hard to think of a task that doesn't involve memory. So even not remembering something, you will remember me telling you not to remember it, okay? It's very hard to think of a study that is not memorizing, because it's something you do all the time. The frontal lobes, on the other hand, are things that seem to be involved in kind of manipulating or holding on to information over time. So it seemed to be involved in working memory, and this is kind of refreshing the information that's in your short-term stores, or manipulating information in your short-term stores. But also what's called working with memory. So this is kind of manipulating how you remember things, or strategies for remembering, or strategies for kind of interrogating the information you remember. So if you damage your frontal lobes, so PFC is your prefrontal cortex, you tend not to be amnesic, but you tend to have disruption in memory all the same, that you forget certain details or that you misremember in systematic ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the idea behind the prefrontal cortex is kind of related to Baddeley's sort of model here. So what Baddeley argues is that you've got these short-term stores. So we've already talked about the visuospatial sketchpad and the phonological loops. So these are your verbal short-term memory and your visual short-term memory. And here, this is kind of your long-term memory. So he argues that short-term memory really is separate from long-term memory. It's not just the temporary activation of it. But what he argues is that you've also got another system here, the central executive, which he kind of equates to the frontal lobes, which are involved in kind of manipulating what information goes in there, how it's rehearsed, and so on. So the claim that you might have kind of, a working memory of 7 rather than 4 is kind of, people have claimed that what's happening is that you've got these kind of mechanisms that are manipulating and maintaining it. And when you knock that out, what's in these stores is a little bit less, maybe 4 items. That's the, coming back to this idea. Okay. What you find if you look at individual neurons in the frontal lobe, so again, this is with animals who are asked to stare at the centre here, and then they see an object appear, and then here, this is just a blank screen, so they don't see this there. What they have to do is just remember where it is, and then afterwards they have to look at where it was. Okay, so this is the delay, holding in mind, and here is the response. What you find is that there are neurons in the frontal lobes which are involved in holding in mind where this is. So here, this is the electrical activity in the neuron. Here, this is time, and then here you can show that the neuron kind of fires. It kind of almost as kind of a burst, holding in mind the location. There are other ones you can do, so holding in mind, say, a shape or a colour or whatever, and you'll see neurons in the frontal lobes that kind of have this burst whilst you're holding something in mind. And the idea is what the neurons encode, so whether or not it's colour, shape or location or whatever, is quite flexible depending on what the task is. So they're not kind of tuned to very specific features. in the same way as the back of the brain is, in effect. It's a lot more flexible what they tune into, depending on what the task is. So this is one model of working memory, in effect, is that what you've got are memory stores at the back of the brain, and then what your frontal lobes do is effectively refresh that information. And this is these two ones would be here. So this is kind of the back of the brain where you kind of store information. And then the idea here is you've got a part of the brain that is involved in refreshing that. So you've got these kind of loops between the back of the brain and the front that kind of holds information in mind. In Petrides' model, he also has another one here. So you've got a division between what's called the dorsolateral and the ventrolateral, the top and the bottom parts of the frontal lobe, in effect. One that kind of is involved in refreshing, and one that's involved in manipulating or kind of changing the information that you're holding in mind. So what he's trying to do is divide the frontal lobes into different aspects of working memory, and not just thinking about it as a kind of holding in mind kind of loop that you can actually manipulate the information to. So the kind of task that he's used is these sorts of tasks here. He calls it the self-ordered pointing task. So what you do is you just get shown a series of objects like this. On the first trial, you can just choose whichever one you like. So let's choose the rabbit, for instance. In the second one, you can choose whichever object you like, provided it's new. Okay? So now you might pick the brush and you kind of avoid the rabbit. So notice that they're kind of moving. So you've got to kind of update which ones you've done. And here, for instance, you've got to choose again something that's new. So now you've got to avoid the rabbit and the brush and pick something new. So you've got to kind of constantly update your kind of working memory here. Okay, so you're holding in mind a set of items, but you're also adding new items to it over time. And what you find is that damage to your frontal lobes kind of impairs this sort of task here, where you're having to update that. And also, if you do brain imaging, so this is using an older method called PET rather than fMRI, you can also show that somewhat different regions of the frontal lobes are involved in different aspects of this task. So just holding on to the spatial information is involved in the kind of ventrolateral, the lower part. So here that would kind of be the delay period in which you kind of just hold in mind what you've chosen. Was actually updating it, so you actually add a new item onto the things there, involves the more dorsolateral, or choosing which item from the set to choose, and adding that to the list would involve that. So you've kind of got a difference between these different regions depending on which aspects of the task you're doing at a given moment. So there are other theories that kind of suggest that these two parts of the frontal lobes, your ventral and your more dorsal parts, are serving somewhat different functions along the lines of what Petrides says here. What you find in humans is that there is some difference between what the left and the right hemispheres do. So the left hemisphere, oops, sorry, I haven't got a picture of it, I thought I did. So the left hemisphere seems to be particularly involved in holding in mind words, and the right hemisphere seems to be involved more in holding in mind pictures. Okay? So you've got, again, some specialism in the frontal lobes that kind of reflects the division of labour in the posterior part. What you also have here is that depending on the strategy that you use, will also activate the frontal lobe. So if you're given words to remember and you're asked to process them deeply, so you're asked to kind of think of a semantic association for a word, you will activate your frontal lobes more than if you're asked to process it shallowly. And this is kind of consistent with the kind of literature I've talked about before, that the frontal lobes are involved in kind of retrieving information from semantic memory. And here what you're having to do is to kind of deeply think about how different parts of semantic memory are connected. Okay? And this activates more your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, so the one involved in kind of selecting and refreshing from semantic memory. What you also find is that what you can do in brain imaging studies is that you can show participants a list of words. So you can show someone, say, a list of 30 words, and you get them just to study them at encoding, so one word after another. Then a test, what you do is that you might have, say, 10 words that are forgotten and 20 words that are remembered. Okay? What you can then do is ask, when you actually saw those words for the first time, what was happening in your brain that would predict what subsequently gets remembered or forgotten? So at the time of doing the study, all the participants is doing is seeing 30 words, and you've got no idea which ones are remembered or forgotten. But then you can do the test, and then you can go back and check what was happening in the person's brain originally when they saw that word, before they knew whether it was going to be remembered or forgotten. So it's kind of a rather sophisticated way of analysing this here to try and predict how you actually remember. And again, what you find is that the frontal lobes, particularly again here, this part involved in refreshing information, your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, here predicts what is remembered and forgotten. So here this is just the bold signal, so this is your change over time and your percentage signal change. So when that part of the frontal lobe is more active, it means you're more likely to remember than when it's down. And here, this is a region in your medial temporal lobe that shows the same effect. So the idea here is you've kind of got this coupling effect between the two. So your frontal lobes might be more attention-based or kind of refreshing information or processing information more deeply. And then this then affects your ability to remember, which is probably more a core function of the medial temporal lobes. So if all you're what you can also do is that you can then get people to actually maintain or kind of reorder items. So instead of just kind of looking at the list, if they then restructure the list, say, into a different categories, so they try and reorder items in terms of animals versus objects or whatever, then you get the dorsolateral part, so the part here, the top part there that's more involved in manipulating. This predicts what you remember or what you forget. So if all you're doing is just rehearsing the information, this part seems to be active. If what you're doing is actually restructuring the information as you see them, then this predicts what you're going to remember or forget. So you've got different parts of the frontal lobes doing somewhat different things. So this is talking about the frontal lobes in terms of memory encoding, how you process things when you see them in order to help you remember them later. But also your frontal lobes are involved in kind of reinstating parts of the context, or kind of searching memory would be part of it. So we talk about your medial temporal lobes as storing context, but to some extent what your frontal lobes would do is to kind of decide whether that information is trustworthy or not, or how confident you are in that memory. And that seems to be what's involved. So, for instance, if you're given a clue as to what some of the words were, you activate your frontal lobes less. Whereas if you have to cue yourself, you're not given any clues, then you activate your frontal lobes more. So, kind of a self-cueing event seems to activate the frontal lobes, particularly the dorsolateral, so kind of the one that's involved in manipulating information. If you're having to retrieve it yourself, this involves this there. Also, if you're having to think about the context, or you're having to think about kind of your confidence in your memory, then this also activates this part of the frontal lobes as well. So it suggests here that although the frontal lobes aren't storing context, it's involved in kind of evaluating it in terms of its reliability. And I won't go through this study, but all the last one is talking about is kind of evaluating whether or not a word was actually heard, or whether you just imagine the word yourself. So that kind of fine judgment seems to involve the frontal lobes there, where you've got a kind of a very fine distinction that where the hippocampal trace might not be fully reliable, you kind of need the frontal lobes to resolve that, or to generate your the actual finer details and monitor that information. So this is kind of just a brief tour of the frontal lobes in relation to memory. In the next lecture we'll talk about the frontal lobes exclusively, so we'll be able to revisit some of these brain regions and some of these ideas, and talk about how the frontal lobes controls behaviour. So don't forget the